I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. My topic today is Truth is Like a Chameleon, and that is spelled, of course, like lion. I have been coming up on a 1 year anniversary of my Malone awakening, and so I'm going to do on Substack a retrospective of the 16 episodes that I have done related to Robert Malone. At the same time, I want to record a new one to update everyone on what's happening with the Breggins lawsuit that Malone had launched. And then I also want to look at the initial Mattias Desmet interview with Tucker Carlson. I had never seen that, and then a new viewer sent the link and said, "Oh, you have to watch this interview. This is well worth your time. Mattias tells us about what's really happening and what we can do about it." And that is the initial interview from over a year ago. I had never seen it, and I'm glad that I waited because it's been a year for a lot of new revelations. So let's look at this. To start with the lawsuit, let me read you this from the Breggins Post. Judge Norman K. Moon, who is also presiding over Malone's case against the Breggins and Dr. Jane Ruby, ordered the dismissal of Dr. Malone's defamation lawsuit against the Washington Post. Specifically, Judge Moon directed the clerk to strike this case from the docket. He invoked Virginia's anti-SLAPP law, which allows a judge to dismiss a case deemed without merit, essentially throwing it out of the court. At his discretion in an anti-SLAPP suit, the judge can also require the plaintiff to pay the defendant's legal fees. But Judge Moon decided not to require this of Malone, in part because the newspaper's resources are so much larger than Malone's. In dismissing Malone's lawsuit against the newspaper, Judge Moon pointed out that Malone's lawsuit was dealing with COVID-19 and the vaccines, matters of serious public interest, which were protected by the First Amendment and should not be stifled. He also found that Malone failed to document malice on the part of the Washington Post. However, the judge was critical of Malone and issued a strong warning to Malone about continuing to bring defamation lawsuits. Nevertheless, the court notes that plaintiff has filed repeated defamation cases and is represented by a lawyer who has sued defendant 3 times in the past 3 years, and that means the Washington Post. And if plaintiff continues to bring defamation actions like those that have been dismissed, there will come a time when the lawsuits might fairly be deemed frivolous and awarding attorney fees is appropriate. So in that, he's talking about Stephen Biss, and I'm going to link to one of my articles, which is on who is Robert Malone's lawyer. And so Stephen Biss has had 3 lawsuits against the Washington Post specifically for defamation. He, it turns out, is very sick and possibly in a coma, which has been known to the public for some time, but Malone has just revealed that to the court and asked for 3 months to get a new lawyer. And the court has given him 1 month. So is it my imagination, or do people around Malone often seem to get sick? So this is something that is going to be continued, but I have a very good feeling about this judge and the way in which they're seeing clearly that these are things that we should be talking about and not things to be stifled. Now let's look at the interview of Mattias Desmet by Tucker Carlson. First, a word about Tucker. He seems to be in the center of all of these Malone hoaxes. Initially, when Malone was launched with Brett Weinstein and Steve Kirsch, those were 3 people who were all working closely with Tucker Carlson. and the whole Project Veritas, which I talk about in one called Is Malone the Zelensky of the COVID con? And I look at that as such an obvious scam that I think we need to take a much closer look at his role in terms of setting all of this up and telling us how we should be interpreting it. Tucker introduces this interview by going to a clip of Robert Malone where he says, "What happened to the Germans in the 1930s? They went barking mad." And that has been the overall analogy for how people are reacting today, is that we have to watch out for this mass formation or mass formation psychosis, as Malone calls it, because look at what happened to the Germans. So I'm glad that I waited a year to see this, because in that year I've done 5 episodes taking a much closer look at what it was that happened in Germany, what was done to them after World War I. So let's look at the definition of barking mad. Was Churchill barking mad when he decided that he would bomb civilian cities, which had never been done, far away from the front line, in order to provoke them to bomb cities in Europe? Because that would prolong the war. That would get people committed to this war, which they were not before. Was that barking mad? I think that Churchill sees that, and maybe Mattias Desmet and Tucker Carlson, as a very civilized thing to do. As a matter of fact, Churchill, we can even picture him saying barking mad. So the things that are done are not what we see as barking mad. What we look at is who did them. And that's why we look at things like Vietnam and all of the atrocities. I just was looking at a paper that was giving photos of babies with 2 heads from Agent Orange, and all the defoliants that were used and the things that were initially done there that are now being in more common use. So those are not things that we consider barking mad. Those are things that, as a matter of fact, the Department of Defense, the CIA, and DARPA are all a part of. And Robert Malone is a part of them. So that's, I think, a big flaw in this whole theory of barking mad. Tucker asked Desmet, "How did you get started in all this?" And Desmet talks about his father, who I think is someone I would like, who didn't want him to go to university, who was someone who read all the time and believed that anything that you wanted to know, you could find out, and that you didn't need any kind of authority to tell you about it. So he thought that everyone should be working with their hands, doing manual labor, and that studying was something that you should be doing for an entire life on the side. But Desmet did not listen to that, and instead he went to university and continued on and got his doctorate in statistics. And his doctoral dissertation was showing that 85% of scientific studies were flawed, were essentially wrong. 85%. And even though he presented his findings very clearly, only 5% of people could actually see it. So that was where he learned not to care about what other people thought and whether he was very popular, because he was not having that unusual idea of his own superiority. And so he was prepared for it when everyone rejected him at the university because of his views later on. Tucker seems to take this 85% number of flawed studies and the magic 5% who can actually see it as a fact. And he says this is just a feature of human nature. And Desmet talks about, yes, you have the Nazis, you have the Soviets, and now you have this. And there's only in any of those cases 5% who have the moral fiber to be able to speak out. So neither of them seem to put themselves in the categories of people who may be deluded about anything, that they only see that they have this magic ability to be able to see through things when no one else can. Desmet then gives the example of hypnosis as so strong that surgery is regularly done on someone who is hypnotized, and even sawing right through the breastbone. This has since been debunked, and Desmet has taken that back and said that no, that never actually happened. When he talks about what this mass formation does, he says that it leads people to make a diabolical pact with their leaders and have them lead them into totalitarian regimes. But he says not to worry because they're always self-destructive. And so those people, the 95%, they'll destroy themselves before it actually gets to around to destroying you. And so he mentions those people who hold out ethically while everyone else around them caves, and mentions Primo Levi and Viktor Frankl and Solzhenitsyn. Tucker asks, what makes people take one path or the other? And Desmet says, we don't know. The people who see the truth are as diverse as can be, and the others engage in rituals of self-sacrifice in order to alleviate their sense of atomization and isolation. So he sees that as the cause rather than a symptom of something that is being done to them. He says that the problem is that we are trying to reduce the mysteries of life into a set of rational, logical arguments, and that you can't do that. That when you study an object, you need to resonate with that object empathically. And so you need to be in direct engagement with that. And that we can't take all of these mysteries and think that they can be applied to rational thinking. So I'd like to ask the question, what is statistics? Because that sounds like a religion to me. And how does anyone prove anything if not with statistics? I would love to be getting my hands on the actual numbers with this whole COVID con, because I think that those numbers tell the truth. That if you ask an honest question, and that's how you're phrasing your hypothesis, you can get an honest answer from statistics. And what he was doing is showing that, oh, these were flawed. And I agree with him in terms of the way that things have been done in the last 3 years. But what is going to show the truth of that is statistics. To conclude, Guy Duperel, whose first name I've been mispronouncing as Guy while I was worried about his last name, has been looking in his Substack, which is Becoming a Refugee in the Time of COVID, at the Lord of the Flies. He was the first one to tell me about the Annika Lucas video, and so we've both been looking at this way of pedo-sadist cults passing on the trauma from one generation to the next. And this was a very interesting post in looking at how stories do that. Lord of the Flies has been taught in high schools as if it is gospel, as if it is just the way things are. And that for me, I remember being extremely traumatizing. What it turns out is that the author was someone who was haunted by these sadistic, masochistic fantasies that he felt were so real that he would write them down. And those became those stories. But in reality, there is a real Lord of the Flies where I think it's 6 boys get shipwrecked on an island for 15 months. And they say cooperation was the key to our success. So how many of those stories are we internalizing as if these are truth, as if they prove that human nature is just violent and cruel, and it's only authority and civilization that keeps us in check? That's something that I think is again and again and again a theme of our histories. When I look at World War II and World War I, and also of our scriptures. Our authoritarian scriptures continually have this theme of the sinful other, the violent other, the self as being the only one that is being set upon by all of these other forces. So I think that we need to overcome these stories of trauma that keep getting passed down, and we need to question them, and that believing the worst is not being realistic. Sometimes I think we need to examine what is the best of us and not take on faith that the worst exists. To follow up, here is Who is Robert Malone's Lawyer? And this is the Robert Malone playlist that will have Is Malone the Zelensky of the COVID con and 15 others. And please go to Substack, and then you can see all of those nicely laid out, and you can look for Hollywood and pedo-sadist cults that got me kicked off of YouTube for a week. Thank you for watching.